and take it away.
Okay, can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. Well, yeah, thanks so much, Matt. Yes, I'll be selecting some of the highlights in our upcoming May auction. It takes place on the 10th and the 11th of this month. There are so many highlights that naturally it's difficult to narrow them down. I've selected some of mine, sometimes because I find them really interesting and sometimes because I happen to really love the works. I'll move through some of them quicker than others. Some I will linger on a bit longer, try and pull out some of the international sort of associations and hopefully broaden your understanding of some of these works. But I thought I'd actually start with a question, and that is, these are both works in the upcoming auction, but I was wondering if anybody could immediately pick up the link between these two works. You're all on mute, obviously, so you can't answer, but I suppose despite their enormous stylistic differences, the link between them is this man. They were both painted by Walter Battus, which seems strange, as I say, bearing in mind that enormous stylistic difference, but they certainly were. I think a lot of us think of Walter Battus as an outrageous, larger-than-life, wild artistic figure. There are countless stories of him parading through homes and streets naked or with big gold nuggets sort of chained around his neck. There's stories about government officials being sent to take a close look on this wild artist to see if he might be a threat to the state. But the conclusions drawn always were that he was only an enormous risk to himself, certainly not the country. But here he is with his sort of long white hair. Later in life, his goatee, his very distinctive profile. And the point I'd like to make is that despite this reputation that Walter has, rightfully so, his early years and his early style was remarkably different. He was a relatively straight-laced, conservative young man, and that was reflected in his early style. To give you a little bit of background, he was born in 1906. He was born in Somerset East in the Karoo. As a young boy, he moved to Koffiefontein, which I don't think had much going for it then. I don't think it has too much going for it now either, other than that famous enormous coffee pot. It was a coffee stopover station for the travelers moving between the coast and the diamond mines in Kimberley. And then the family moved to Fouriesmith in about 1919, which is where he finished his schooling. The important thing about his time in Koffiefontein, I'll broaden that out in a minute, is it happens to be a bit of a hotspot for sand painting or rock art, which of course informed so much of his later career. This is a very young Walter Battus in the early 1920s. He took up a position as a clerk of the magistrate's court in Rustenburg in about 1923, 1924. He then takes a teaching diploma in Johannesburg in 1932, 1933. This is him, the top right corner again, a sort of very recognizable face. And as I say, that's 1932, 1933. In 1936, he takes up a position as the art master at Pretoria Boys High School. And he has a 30-year relationship with Pretoria Boys, spending some time traveling away, but generally keeping a very close relationship with the school. This is a wonderful painting. It must be from the late 1930s, early 1940s, of an athletics meet at Pretoria Boys. It's just a detail, a little taster too, because it happens to be coming up in a Johannesburg auction later this year. But back to this picture, it's lot 346. It's called Spring Felt Scene. And if you look at those estimates, very, very attractive. This is a similar work from that period. It's the church at Somerset East. and I'm showing it to you in some detail so you can hopefully get a sense of this, I suppose, pseudo-impressionist style that Walter was following in the 1930s and the very early 1940s. He's looking very much at those late 19th century masters in terms of his inspiration, but there's nothing whatsoever wild about a work such as this. That's in no way to undermine, it's in no way undermining the work. If anything, you know, I happen to feel that some of these early works by Battis, the 1930s, early 1940s, are very definitely some of his most spectacular. This is just an aside. It happens to be another auction, another painting on the upcoming sales by another Walter, Walter Meyer, and it happens to be a house on Paulette Street in Somerset East. So a number of connections between Walter Meyer and Walter Battis in Somerset East. Paulette Street also happens to be the street where the Walter Battis Museum still runs from. I'm always struck by Walter Battis's early style, particularly his watercolors, and also the very obvious link to at least two contemporary artists that Walter knew and in some cases worked with very closely. And to give you that kind of stylistic comparison, I'm showing you this work by Walter, which is a watercolor, of course, and comparing it to this by Sidney Carter. Sidney Carter, who was dead by 1945, was a fabulous watercolorist who I think is often underappreciated. But if you look at the way both these artists worked their watercolors, how the sort of colors seep into this thirsty card, I think you'll agree with me that there are so many stylistic similarities. Here's another early Walter Battis watercolor, and I'm comparing it to this one, which is, of course, by Erich Meyer. Now, Erich Meyer, the German-trained artist who arrived in Southern Africa in 1899, was one of the most important early influences on Walter Battis in two very important ways. First and foremost, stylistically. If you look at the work on the left there, that is Erich Meyer on St. Helena, where he was a prisoner of war during the Anglo-Boer War 1900-1901. And on the right, a watercolor by Walter Battis. And the younger man, Walter, certainly looked up to Erich Meyer stylistically. It's also important to note that a young Walter Battis, about 1926, when he was a clerk in Rustenburg, happened to meet Erich Meyer. And Erich Meyer very much encouraged Walter's formative interest in rock art or sand art. And from that period, from really the early 1930s, 1930s onwards, and through his early years at Pretoria Boys High, Walter becomes besotted by sand art. And these are just some of the copies that he would have produced from life comparisons in various caves, mainly in the Free State. Here he is on an expedition in Bethlehem. Well, I don't think I need to point him out. He's on the right there with that big grin and that big nose. But again, notice how he's dressed. He's very much dressed in the garb of the time. He's not outrageous in any way. But this is really the start of his absolute love and fascination with rock art. As I say, very much influenced by Erich Meyer. He took the interest very seriously. He was a well-published author during his long career, but some of the very early publications of these, The Amazing Bushman by Walter Battis on the left, which was published in 1938, 1939, I think it's very much a collector's item. I think the first edition only included about 200 copies. And then a little bit later, in the late 1940s, the very famous Artists of the Rocks, a book that he famously gave to Pablo Picasso, and Picasso made those well-known comments about whether Walter thought that Picasso's drawings compared favorably with the rock art. I told you, 1936 he joins Pretoria Boys. In 1938, Walter Battis joins the new group, that very well-known group of South African artists who had banded together to exhibit work that they felt had a Eurocentric bias and was particularly avant-garde in spirit. It was mainly based in the Cape, but Walter took over the Untitled Chapter, which was ironic in some ways because he had, up until that point, never actually been to Europe. But he does go to Europe. He makes his first trip in 1938, which is almost certainly when he would have painted this work. It's called The Early Men. And there's a wonderful inscription on the back of this painting, which you can read on our website. We sold this work about 2 years ago in a Cape Town auction, where he singles this out as the moment that he starts to integrate his influences from his rock art studies into his sort of mainstream style. You know, he referred to this strain as a primitive strain, you know, not necessarily a politically correct term now, but one that he certainly used, and he used with enormous respect. Anyway, that leads us to a work like this, which is a little bit later. It's lot 603, called Abstract Figures. This comes from the Kangra collection, put together, well, I suppose, as Kirsty has spoken about in the past, by the late Bex. It's a fabulous work. The colors naturally are wonderful. You see all the elements of the rock art influences. These very linear, angular figures, these patches of paint, these decorative elements in this sort of watery element, as well as these trees and leaves and flora and fauna. Another fantastic Walter Battis on our sale is this, a larger work of birds. That's lot 604. And again, I think you can't look at a picture like this without thinking of being faced with rock art. The ideas of these patches of color, delineating space and marking out space, and then almost a calligraphic way of marking down a narrative or the action. In this case, very much dominated by trees and birds and different horizon lines. The next highlight or gem in the sale is this work. It's lot 515 by Michael Taylor. It's called No Easy Way Out. I love this painting so much. I haven't seen it in the flesh, but it certainly caught my attention going through the catalogue. And I'll be honest, I was drawn to it entirely because of its pure decorative properties. I didn't see much in it other than maybe a sense of this sort of yellow, fiery jungle. But I suppose one of the wonderful things about new, fresh works coming to auction is the chance to delve into them a little bit deeper, which I've done. And this work comes from a solo show at What If the World in Cape Town late in 2012. It was an exhibition called Mumbo Jumbo. Those of you who don't know Michael Taylor, this is him, or certainly his right ear, working on monotypes with his T. Michael Taylor studied at Stellenbosch University. He was born in 1979, so very much a young artist. But yes, as I was saying, I was very much drawn to the pure decorative qualities of this work. But on close inspection, a few things started emerging. So yes, you see the palm trees on the horizon there, but I hope you'll be able to make out a figure in the bottom here, lying down, seemingly in some distress. There's his shock of brown hair, face down in the dirt, these very globular fingers, his right hand sort of reaching up to the sky, his red shorts, bare calves, and these big boots. And of course, you get a sense of some kind of momentary turmoil in a picture like this, as well as some sense of loneliness. This is another work from that show by Michael Taylor on the left, that is. It's a work called Looking for Trouble. And again, it's this figure, this almost white-gloved figure, hiking figure facing some kind of journey or jungle environment. And if you read some of the notes to this exhibition, you'll read about various psychoanalytical associations between maybe one's ego and an island, and I think Michael Taylor used that as a foundation point to begin this group of drawings and paintings. Of course, it has a romantic element. I think is a very clear comparison to Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer, the famous German romantic painting from 1818, which I'm showing you on the right. There's no doubt in my mind the two are very much linked.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we might have lost Alastair there for a second. Can you all hear me? Or is it just Al that is gone?
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
All right. Super. Let's just give Alastair 2 seconds to 2 seconds to jump back onto his machine. I think this is one of the challenges, I suppose, with technology is unstable internet connections. We are, ladies and gentlemen, recording these, so they will be available on our YouTube account. Just to as a note, I'm just going to stop sharing Al's window. And I'm going to share mine while we wait for Alastair to join us again, or just to regain his internet connection. Ladies and gentlemen, so if you'll just pardon us, and we'll just give us 2 minutes, and I'm sure we'll be back with you in a second.
I'm back. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. We seem to have lost power, but we back temporarily. Well, let me get back to my screen. I don't know where I lost you, but I'll continue from here if that's okay. Can everyone see the screen again? Matt, can you see the screen?
No, Al, we can't see the screen.
No? Got it? Okay, great.
Yes, we can see.
Okay. Sorry about that.
I say, anyway, great. Thank you.
Back to Michael Taylor. I think I maybe went through the obvious link between a work like this and the Caspar David Friedrich on the right. I think I was starting to say that this has a very interesting sort of foundational story in terms of the content, and it comes from a poem that I think Michael Taylor wrote himself. It was a poem called Mumbo Jumbo, and it goes like this: Mumbo Jumbo, you again, looking for trouble, stick to what you know, two-timer. This is a monologue, no easy way in, no easy way out. Every man is an island, easy peasy paradise. Surprise, surprise, this is what you get, good old Mumbo Jumbo. And I love the fact that he used these lines as essentially inspiration for an entire show, and he illustrated all of them, which is why you have works like this: you again, looking for trouble, stick to what you know, two-timer, this is a monologue, no easy way in, no easy way out, which is of course the work featuring in our sale. Every man is an island, easy peasy paradise, surprise, surprise, this is what you get, and good old Mumbo Jumbo. I must say I would have loved to have seen the show in Cape Town. I love how it all ties together as a neat single narrative story. And yes, I suppose if you delve into it, there is the sort of analyzing oneself and one's ego, and the metaphor, I suppose, comes out in this backpacking figure facing some kind of journey or island. So the images themselves are interspersed with this figure moving through the landscape and all the challenges it presents. I think it's a fantastic work, despite being just wonderfully decorative. Lot 627, one of the major highlights in the evening session, is of course by Peter Clarke, and it's called The Fruit Vendor. It is a large, commanding oil painting. As you know, there aren't too many oil paintings around by Peter Clarke. He was far more prolific as a watercolorist or working in gouache. But this is from arguably one of his most exciting periods, from the late 1950s into the early 1960s. His sort of so-called Teslar's dull period, where he was visiting that little town every spring, I think, and returning to Simonstown, usually before Christmas, with all these new ideas. What is this work? Well, of course, it shows a figure with a basket full of fruits and vegetables. It is a Cape cityscape, I would imagine. There is a mother and child walking in the background, another vendor with a head of cauliflower and some apples in his cart, looking across the street to these relatively nondescript buildings. Naturally, like all works by Peter Clarke, it is loaded with socio-political weight and commentary. Of course, you can't look at a picture like this without seeing the racial overtones. On the one hand, it might very well be a vendor selling his wares out in the street, or it could be what was contemporaneously termed a houseboy, also of course a hugely derogatory term, but the idea that this young gentleman had been dressed up in this khaki suit with all its colonial overtones and sent out to essentially buy fruit and vegetables for his employer, for the homestead. So there is an element of ambiguity in terms of what he's actually doing. Wilhelm, my colleague, wrote a brilliant text for this work. It's in the catalogue, and I'm not going to go through everything because you can, of course, go and read it yourself. But he makes this wonderful comparison to other similar works from the South African art tradition of these, in some way, exotic figures, and of course that's a loaded term in itself, with this abundance of fruit and vegetables. I'm showing you Irma Stearns, African woman from 1945 in that wonderful Zanzibari frame, and then the very famous Fruits of Barley by the immediately recognizable Tretyakov. Again, there have been books and books written about these kind of motifs and this kind of colonial aesthetic, both positive and negative. But this Peter Clarke fits very neatly into that hugely important artistic dialogue. It also happens to be a beautiful painting in itself. That wonderful sky and those sort of wriggling clouds moving behind the figure. Great work by Peter Clarke, 1959. Lot 584 is by Frida Locke. It's a still life, a white hyacinth on a chair, and I haven't seen this in the flesh, but I absolutely love this painting for so many reasons. I'll show you some details of it, and I suppose give you a little bit of background to Frida Locke in the process. Of course, it shows a chair set up with this pot and hyacinth flowering beautifully in the top left corner, and this neatly pressed white shirt hanging over that one corner. Look very carefully at the application of paint, particularly in that top register, in that background, those wonderful smears of blue and yellow and sort of oyster pink paints across the surface. Frida Locke was born in Britain, in Cheshire, in fact. She was born in 1902 into, I suppose, a broadly agricultural family. She went to agricultural college in Reading in 1920, which was disrupted when the family decided to move to Stellenbosch in South Africa, and they set up a fruit farm in 1921, which incidentally was the same year that Pierneef had made his very important trip to Stellenbosch, where he met Toon van der Heever, amongst others. Frida's family was unimpressed with her desires to become an artist, but she gets her wish in the early 1930s. She goes to London in 1933, and she enrolls at the Heatherley School of Art in London. I'm showing you a near contemporary photograph from the Heatherley School. This dates from 1927. It's an all women's drawing room, and I expect that a young Frida Locke would have been in this kind of environment, training at the Heatherley School, as I say, in London. She returns to South Africa in 1936, again, to keep it all in context, the same year that Walter Battis joins Pretoria Boys. And in 1938, Frida becomes a founding member of the new group. This is a new group voting, their first vote, where they ultimately elected Gregoire Boonzai as the leader. Very well-known faces here: Terence McCaw at the back, Lippy Lipschitz, Gregoire over there, Florence Zerfie, and then on the right on the margins, is our Frida Locke. I'll be honest, this is pretty much the only photograph we can find of Frida Locke. My colleague Hazel, who's our sort of lead researcher in the Johannesburg office, she's also been trying. We can't really find any other images of Frida, which also gives you a sense of how enormously underappreciated she has been. The idea that we can't even find too many images of her. She is best known for these wonderfully intimate, silent interiors. These are three of them that have appeared in sale rooms over the last decade or so. But these are very much what she's known best for. That center one, the kitchen, a wonderful landmark example. You can see so many of the details, these wonderfully colorful rugs that she had collected. But very much focused on the little things, the innocuous things, the little vases on tabletops, the kettles on the stove, the various trinkets, everything arranged, of course, but arranged haphazardly generally. She was very much a collector of textiles and drew enormous decorative inspiration from them. Of course, I don't think you can look at interiors by Frida Locke and appreciate them without thinking about the forebears in this genre, and that is, of course, the great French intimists, artists like Bonnard and Vuillard and Courcelles and Maurice Denis. And I'm showing you on the right here a pink bedroom by Edward Vuillard. This dates from about 1911. But you'll see the very similar light touch that both artists used in these hazy, intimate interior scenes. Really, really fantastic paintings. In 1947, Frida Locke went to Zanzibar, and she spent about 18 months on the island, where she painted works like the ones I'm showing you here, these shisha smokers on the left, and that Comorian boy on the right. The one on the left is a fantastic picture we sold about 2 years ago. It caused us a number of pretty serious headaches because of this very bizarre marking in the bottom right corner. We simply could not understand what that was, and eventually, thankfully, through some assistance at the various language schools at WITS, as well as some of our clients, we were able to confirm that that is Frida's signature in the Arabic. So another little special element in a work like this. She also did a number of sort of townscapes and mini landscape vignettes while she was in Zanzibar, and some of those are certainly some of my favorites. You'll notice, of course, the Zanzibari frame. The one on the left is by Irma Stern, and the one on the right by Frida Locke. And that was just one of the many reasons why Frida was always compared, inevitably compared to Irma Stern. Stern, of course, had beaten her to Zanzibar. She went twice, first in 1939 and then in 1945. And by all accounts, Stern was furious that Frida dared to also use these wonderful Zanzibari moldings to frame her work. You know, I think in many ways, as dominant as Stern was, I think she could maybe come across, or certainly she comes across in the literature as being a little bit of a bully. Certainly when it comes to other women artists like Maggie Loubser and Frida Locke. Anyway, these are just two comparative details between Stern and Frida Locke from a similar period. The chair with Hyacinth on the right is, of course, from 1960, and this still life by Irma Stern is a late work. It's about 1961 or 1962, I think. But if you look at the way they move paint around their canvases, it was a very similar emotive manner. Again, a late work by Irma Stern on the left, compared to the Hyacinth by Frida Locke on the right. I think you'll notice very quickly how similar their styles were. I have to talk a little bit about the subject, the content, the chair. You know, I do enjoy going off on these art historical tangents, but you can't really look at a picture like this in this late post-impressionist style without thinking of one of the most famous chairs in art history, Vincent's Chair by Vincent van Gogh, painted in 1888. And again, you can never look at Vincent's chair without pairing it with Gauguin's chair from the same year, 1888. Van Gogh, of course, painted both of them in that year, and there have been reams and reams of papers written on the symbolism underlying these two works. Of course, you have Van Gogh's far more simple rural chair on the right with his pipe, and Gauguin's far more flamboyant, intricate design chair on the left with the candle. Of course, there are inevitable mentions of that phallic candle and that limp pipe on the right. I think you can go for days and days speculating about what he might have intended in pictures like this. But the important thing to note is that these do act as portrait surrogates. The idea of painting portraits by using inanimate objects, and in this case, a chair. These are part of a long tradition of important chairs in the international context, at least. The one on the left, 1913, still life with chair caning by Pablo Picasso, of course, one of the foremost works of the synthetic cubist movement. 1913 on the right, the early movements of Dadaism by Marcel Duchamp, his bicycle wheel on the right. Jean Gris, 1917 on the left, a still life with a chair. And then 1919, Henri Matisse, his chair with peaches. Moving into the 1950s, you have Magritte, very much playing on a Victor Hugo title on the left, in a very surrealist image, a far more expressionist one on the right, by Klein. Late 40s, Picasso, who did numerous chairs. This one, his still life with skull on the left, and also by Pablo Picasso, again showing his enormous range on the right, his wonderful sculptured chair from 1961. A little bit later, not too much later, 1964, 1965, one of Andy Warhol's very famous works, his electric chair from, as I say, 1964, 1965. David Hockney has produced some of the most special chair portraits, I would argue. The one on the left, photo collage work, from about 1985. The one in the center from 1988 is, of course, his interpretation, his riff on Gauguin's chair from a century prior to that in 1888, and one on the right from the 90s, 1998, his chair with Panama hat. That tradition is very much found in South Africa too. And when you think about a picture like this and trying to understand it a little bit in terms of portraiture or self-reflection, I think you probably come up with some rather sad thoughts in the case of Frida Locke. I said, well, I've told you this was painted in 1960. Frida Locke died in 1962, so this was very shortly after she painted, before she died. And she died absolutely destitute, having spent time, her last years in Paris and in London, and she died in the Italian hospital on Queen Square in London. I'm showing you an image of that in the bottom right. And to me, as spectacular as this picture is, a very real personal note in terms of Frida Locke's own biography. In South African terms, if you're looking for chair portraits, I think you'd probably start with the wonderful work on the left. It is by Alexis Preller, dates from 1937. Again, this was a time when Preller was absolutely besotted by Van Gogh, and again, he couldn't have painted this picture without Van Gogh's chair firmly in mind. He had been in London in 1934, 1935 at the Westminster School of Art, and he had been exposed firsthand to works by Van Gogh. In the center there, Mine Boy, painted in 1946 by Gerard Sekoto. Again, a very poignant work, bearing in mind it was very shortly before Sekoto takes himself into self-imposed exile in 1947 and never returns to South Africa. And I think you need to look at a picture like Frida Locke's in this kind of century-long context. Moving into the 50s, well, certainly on the left, 1959, the fantastic painting of a chair with lemons by Jack Heath, a work we sold late last year, and a work we sold very recently by the wonderful Sue Davies, and I suppose very much following in the tradition of Jack Heath, having been closely connected to the Heaths over many years. Fantastic work by Sue Davies, painted in 2012. These chairs are, of course, by David Goldblatt. They both date from 1965. And again, they have so much socio-political meaning. The work on the right is the barber's chair and the banksman's chair on the left. After, I think, one of the Randfontein mines was shut down in 1965, and also one of the timber mills on the right. So very evocative of a difficult moment in this context. Going into the 1970s, this is Enzo Duplessis, one of my favorite painters, and a work that he produced for the famous architect Revel Fox, and this is his home in Newlands in Cape Town. And again, it's I suppose, uses chairs, amongst other things, to give some sense of a sitter or some sense of a man or some sense of a presence. So, of course, you see his various collections and trinkets, his artwork, this wonderful herringbone fireplace here, but also most notably in our context, you see his predilection for mid-century modernist furniture. From the early 1980s, Walter Altman, very much a student at the time, working on works, beautiful drawings like this from his home in Monmouth, painting these wire chairs that I think so many of us know from at least a decade or two back. More recently, Goncalo Mabunda, the Maputo-based artist, with his throne produced with decommissioned weapons and arms. Peter Schutz on the right, who did incredible groupings of chairs. And again, using a biographical way of approaching works. This a very poignant example by Robert Hodgins, a late work produced in 1909, shortly before he died, in 2009, shortly before he died in 2010, at 90 years old. And Wilhelm tells this great story about this work, where he found out that Robert had included a chair for every decade, and he's sitting on the final one, his 9th chair, his 9th decade. On a similar note, a fantastic, dramatic painting by Harold Voigt from his studio. I've been lucky enough to be in that studio. It's a magical place, and to see this lone chair like that in front of the artist's canvas is really fabulous. Lot 598 is one of the mega highlights of the auction, a work called The Kraal by Alexis Preller. I have to say, it is a very small work, and Preller, I think more than any other South African artist, packs an enormous punch on a small scale. These are all works that are barely postcard size or biscuit box size that we've sold over the last 2 or 3 years. The Horseman, the 3 Mapocha women, and the fabulous ritual bull on the right, which measured about 7 centimeters by 9 centimeters. But what is this picture? It is, of course, a Ndebele or a Mapocha kraal, or certainly that is the basis of its composition, although it is filled to the brim with various eternal African symbols. It is Preller grappling with the idea of producing something that is intrinsically African, not only in terms of style, but in subject too. It is also a close cousin to this remarkable painting. This is called Kraal 2, and it was painted in 1948. And to give you a broad provenance of this work, Preller conceived this painting in 1948. And the first version that he painted was a relatively small work that went to the Tate in London as part of the overseas exhibition of South African artists. He wasn't entirely satisfied with that first version. He set about producing a second, much more complex, larger version, and that is the version I'm showing you here. This is one of the landmarks of 20th century South African painting. It is owned by the National Gallery and is almost always on show at Ezekiel in Cape Town. It is worth visiting the museum just to see this picture. It is a remarkable example of Preller's relatively early maturity. I'm showing you the one appearing in our sale, which was painted in 1951, and it is one of at least 4 or 5 versions of the kraal that Alexis did. What are we seeing? Of course, we're seeing a lot of overtly African symbols and motifs. Despite the obvious Ndebele elements, the majority of the eye-catching symbols are not Southern African at all. The sort of central figure with the candle on is very much inspired by this Baga drum that I'm showing on the left. Not necessarily the specific one, I'm just showing you a similar example. But Preller is looking at these obvious African elements and trying to integrate it into his own interpretation of an African mythology. You also see this Baga bird appearing all throughout the composition, dotted on the edges, clinging to all these walls. I'm particularly interested in the fact that he chooses these Baga-inspired birds as opposed to his egrets, which he tended to favor later on. His egrets started appearing from about 1947 onwards, and you see them in works like this, the fantastic David on the left and Ritual Bull on the right, and egrets were seen, certainly in Preller's mind, were interpreted as being linked to African ancestors, which is why you always see them with their little needle-like beaks pointing heavenward, very much drawing one's thoughts up into the skies and to the ancestors. In an international context, what else is happening in works like this? Well, he's clearly looking at the great 15th and 16th century northern Italian Renaissance masters like Hieronymus Bosch and Peter Bruegel, the elder as well as the younger. And I'm showing you the Haywain from about 1516 here by Hieronymus Bosch. These intricate scenes, these crazy scenes in many cases, these strange little vignettes, which of course in Bosch's context had very strict religious intentions. But if you look at a work like this by Bruegel, the elder, this is the fight between festival and Lent, or carnival and Lent, and this dates from about 1559. And of course, you could spend hours in front of pictures like this. There are not too many pictures in the international or the Renaissance canon that might include a fat man with a dagger between his legs, sort of straddling a big barrel with a skewered pig. These are fabulous, fantastical pictures that Preller was very much drawing on in works and compositions like the Král. You'll also see in the center here this phallic element. It is based on a slit drum, most likely West African slip drum that he would have seen in Paris in 1937. Also look at the egg, the ubiquitous egg, one of Preller's favorite motifs, which along with the candle very much speaks to the idea of fragility, the idea of trying to protect something like an egg or a flickering flame that is enormously important and fragile. And he very much has conflated that idea with the artist's mind or the artist's imagination. Naturally, you can't really think of Preller's Králs without thinking of Gauguin. This work, which was painted in 1897, 98, again, one of the major works of the late 19th century, early 20th century of post-impressionism, was a work that a contemporary critic explicitly linked to Preller's The Král. It's also interesting to bear in mind that The Král was exhibited at Yggdrasil, which was Preller's studio in Brumaire in Pretoria, literally weeks before Preller made his own Gauguinesque pilgrimage to an island paradise. He, of course, late in 1948 went to the Seychelles and returned only in 1949. Other works by Preller on the sale include these fabulous items. Lot 471 is one of the artist's palettes. I'm guessing it would be a relatively late palette, but this is quite an exceptional item in terms of Preller collecting. I can imagine a good number of institutions and universities licking their lips at trying to get hold of something like this, bearing in mind all the incredible scientific progress being made in terms of analyzing paintings, painters, pigments, and various methods. The work on the right, on the left now, is called Sunslice, and it dates from 1966, and it's part of Preller's period of experimentation with material. From the late 1960s into the early 1970s, Preller was more and more avant-garde in terms of material he used. He experimented with gesso, high levels of surface structure, and of course with his now well-known intaglios, where he's using cast resins to create these three-dimensional painted artworks. And this sun slice is very much from the early moment of that enormous period of creativity. It happens to come with this letter, which accompanied this gift to Auntie Ray, which was the vendor's aunt in this particular case. And I suppose the sun slice has something to do with Auntie Ray. It also has something to do with Dombeya, which was Preller's compound on the outskirts of Hartbeespoort from the late 50s onwards. This was his compound where he lived. I'm showing you an aerial view on the left with most of the buildings produced. But in 1966 specifically, he goes on a renovation project, and he includes a number of new buildings. And he writes about this radial paving that he spends a lot of time designing, and you can see some sense of it on the right. And people were sent out to collect stones and to find natural elements that they might be able to include in this wonderful sun icon, this radial element, as part of the very fabric of his home and his compound and his studio. And I think the sun slice fits very neatly into that moment. You all know these iconic disembodied heads, these angels that Preller is perhaps almost most well known for. These are late works dating from the late 1960s into the 1970s. The work on the left, Red Angel, the one in the center, Poseidon, all major works that we've been lucky enough to sell over the last few years. And we have another major disembodied head from this period, a work called Space Angel in the Cape Town auction. I think I would like to argue that it is physically the biggest Preller that's ever appeared in a Cape Town sale. And it is enormous work with incredible wall power. It's produced in gesso, which means it's built up with various layers of material, then overpainted with gold leaf as well as oils to give this remarkable contoured effect. Of course, it's a microcosm of Preller's iconography. And again, I don't have time to go through everything, but look at that sort of Egyptian, sort of almond-like eye, that wonderful Egyptian profile, those West African teeth or fangs, as well as that sort of pharaonic beard that you see. As I say, a major work which will be appearing in the Cape Town auction in a few days' time. I am enormously interested in these two works, which are, I think, early works in our evening session. There, of course, drawings and watercolors by Henk Pierneef. Extensive mountain landscape with pine trees on the left, a very large work in a rather unusual format for Pierneef. On the right, the arrival of Jan van Riebeck in Table Bay in 1652. And these are very interesting for a number of reasons. Of course, a drawing like this is what we would describe as a cartoon. That is to say, these are preparatory drawings that would inevitably be scaled up for larger murals or decorative schemes. And yes, you see all the typical Pierneef elements, those jagged mountains on the horizon, this cloudburst, and these heaven-reaching camel thorns or acacias that very much became the symbol of Pierneef's idea of the South African landscape. This kind of historical picture is very unusual for Pierneef. I will give you a reason why he did it in a moment. Both of these drawings come from 1933, which is significant because they are directly related to the decorative program of South Africa House, the High Commission in London. On Trafalgar Square, on the corner of Duncannon and the Strand, a building designed by Sir Herbert Baker and overseen by the High Commissioner Charles Tavata from about 1932 to 1936, 1937. I'm showing you their majesties on the right, who arrive in the royal landau with Jan Smuts in tow. It was the first time that a head of state had traveled with their majesties in the carriage, and they are arriving at the opening of South Africa House in the middle of 1933. Now, at this point, there was almost no decoration inside it, but the wheels were very much turning in terms of which artists would be chosen to produce pictures and sculpture for the interior of this building. And the two main painters selected to oversee the scheme were Henk Pierneef and an artist called Jan Juter. Now, this is 1933. Pierneef would have been chosen for so many reasons, the most obvious being the enormous success of his so-called station panels, which he started in 1929 and were installed in the Johannesburg station by 1932. And I wonder, yes, I do have this image of the station shortly before it opens, these wonderful vaults, and you can just see, rather small, I admit, these enormous Pierneefs installed by Marouflage 3 or 4 meters up from the ground floor concourse. And as I say, an enormously successful commission, arguably the most important 20th century commission, or parastatal commission, certainly in the 20th century in South Africa. And on the back of this success, Pierneef was chosen to decorate or provide murals for South Africa House. And these are some of them, 4 of them only. They are virtual reinstatements of some of his work for the station. Although even bigger and in some case more carefully painted and not quite as decorative as the station panels. These are horrible grainy pictures solely because, well, you're simply not allowed to take images inside there despite numerous attempts over the last decade. I still haven't had any luck getting decent images. Incidentally, one of the other painters considered for the scheme was Edward Wolff, although he never produced anything for the scheme. He did give us these 2 fantastic lots, 487 and 479, which are in our sale. That wonderful Bloomsbury-like tray on the left, and that group of women from Mexico I'm showing you on the right. Pierneef, as I say, was commissioned to produce, I think he eventually did 8 or 9 murals for South Africa House. And at some point, clearly, he was considering focusing on this historic moment of Jan van Riebeeck landing at the Cape of Good Hope. And for whatever reason, he didn't follow that sort of original thought, and the historical pictures were done by Jan Juter, and this is his version of the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck, which was enormously controversial when it was unveiled in the mid-1930s. Controversial because it showed, certainly in the eyes of the Afrikaans intelligentsia, a Catholic image of Jan van Riebeeck giving thanks under a cross, as opposed to a Protestant image, which would have been preferred by the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa, as well as the Afrikaans intelligentsia. But of course, you have a lot of similar elements in both pictures. You see the Dromedaris and the Reiger and the Goede Hoop, the 3 ships that brought Van Riebeeck and his entourage to the Cape in that year. I'm not going to dwell too much on these because I know I'll run out of time. But I told you that work by Juter was hugely controversial, and it was in fact taken down, and it was absorbed into the National Gallery, and it was lost sometime in the 70s, and it is still lost. But Juter was commissioned to paint a far more sanitized version, which he does here in this large-scale triptych, where he relied entirely on Van Riebeeck's dagverhaal, his journal, his diary of exactly what happened when they arrived in the Cape in that year. I'm showing it to you because this large triptych space had originally been given to another South African artist to decorate and to fill, and that was Alfred Neville Lewis. And for whatever reasons, Neville Lewis was never finally commissioned to fill those 3 large panel spaces outside the High Commissioner's office, and Juta ended up getting the commission. But we do have this wonderful example by Neville Lewis coming up in the sale. It's not 484, a seated Zulu woman, and can't spend too much time on it. But these are some of the other works that are part of that context of those PNF drawings. These are all works that were being produced for that decorative program. So you have Kurt Steenberg carving out Bartholomew Diaz in the niche on the corner of Duncannon and the Strand. Van Vaux gave this wonderful little bronze fountain. John Henry Amschewitz, Gwelo Goodman is sending canvases, much to Herbert Baker's disgust, from his studio in Cape Town. And then these 2 young artists, Eleanor Esmond White and LaRue Smith LaRue, get plucked from relative obscurity, trained in London and in Rome to produce this remarkable pure egg tempera fresco on the first floor of South Africa House, the so-called Zuluru. I think this is the last one I'm going to talk about. It's not 537, and it's a work called Devil by Brett Murray. Brett Murray, of course, famous for his spear, or infamous for his spear, but perhaps far better known for works like the one I'm showing on the right, a political, deeply satirical, beautifully executed smooth bronze called The Party versus the People. And Brett Murray has produced numerous works in this spirit and in this vein. These are certainly works that he's become so well known for over the last 10 or 15 years, maybe from about 2005, 2006. This, a more recent work, a white elephant carved in Carrara marble, but this beautifully sleek, perfect surface that, as I say, the artist is now so well known for. And what I found so interesting about this Devil work was how it fitted into his stylistic development. I'll be honest, I didn't know too much about this work, so this kind of information was new to me too. But it does come from a very, very early show that Brett Murray did in 1991, and it was exhibited alongside other works that I'm showing you here. And these tended to be satirical personifications of leaders and figures of authority. So yes, you have the devil on the left, which is appearing in our sale, and it was exhibited alongside that central figure, which is called Voortrekker, and the work on the right, a work called Soldier. So obviously deeply satirical, which has been a strain leading through all of Brett Murray's work. But I suppose the stylistic point I wanted to make was that this devil is a very, very early formative example of Brett Murray's output, which is now so very well known. And I love the sense of development, moving from the sort of rough and ready clay and resin sculptural elements produced by an artist who at the time is unknown and doesn't have the kind of budget to produce these perfectly finished bronzes and marbles. So a really formative sculpture in that kind of context. Comes from a similar period to these 2 works, which have appeared in our sale rooms over the last 18 months. The work on the left called Self-Portrait, or The Artist, and the one on the right, a work called The King. Now, these came from Brett Murray's sort of master's years, and were direct precursors to these tubby, spherical figures that he continued to develop. I love the fact that there's still so much to learn and so much to be excited by in the South African art context. And one little example is a personal one. And as I was trying to work out what this Brett Murray Devil was all about, I came across this poster, and it's a poster for an exhibition that was held in 1991 at the South African Association of Arts in Church Street in Cape Town. It was called B&B, or BB, and it was an exhibition of sculptures by the two young, I suppose even then relatively wild sculptors, Brett Murray and Barend de Wet. Now, Barend de Wet sadly passed away a year ago or something. But we know that Devil appeared in this particular exhibition, and I've been desperately trying to find out which works by Barend de Wet were exhibited alongside. I still haven't been able to. I'm sure Wilhelm will probably have this catalogue, will be able to tell me exactly, or Sean O'Toole, or someone like that. But I still haven't quite worked out exactly in which context that devil, that tubby devil, was exhibited in 1991 at the SA Association of Arts. It also got me thinking about Brett Murray's direct influences. And I suppose I would argue the most important influence is this man. I don't know if anyone can identify him, but I'm showing you an image of him in 1961, carving an award-winning work called Wonderstone. In the middle, a photograph of this artist and academic and curator from his sort of subsistence farming days in the 70s in the foothills of the Drakensberg. He's also the same man that happened to publish the catalogue raisonné of one of his mentors, Lippy Lipschitz. I think I've edited out the name, but I don't know if anybody of you or anybody knows who this is. This is, of course, Bruce Arnott. And now Bruce was a sculpture teacher at Michaelis and very much worked with Brett Murray in those formative years. And I think when you see works like this, early works or mid-career works rather, by Bruce Arnott, you'll see the very obvious stylistic inspiration for Brett Murray. The work on the left was conceived in 1976, cast in bronze in 1979, a fabulous work called The Citizen, a work in so many ways so far ahead of its time. I don't know if any of you know where that is. The work on the right is called Numinous Beast, again from 1979, again by Bruce Arnott. And both of these major sculptures by, I would argue, one of the most important and almost entirely forgotten 20th century South African sculptors, are erected outside two of our most important art institutions. The Citizen stands outside the Johannesburg Art Gallery on Joubert Park in town. And of course, Numinous Beast, you all would have seen it in Cape Town at the entrance of the Ezeco National Museum. Making this comparison, teacher and student, to me, it's enormously sad that someone like Bruce Arnott doesn't have the enormous credit that he deserves. And to put that into context, Strauss & Company has handled one work by Bruce Arnott in over a decade of sales. As far as I can tell, there have probably been 2 or 3 that have ever appeared on the secondary market in South Africa. And that to me is just absolutely outrageous, but it's also enormously exciting, certainly from an auctioneer's perspective or an art historian's perspective, that there is so much fantastic and relatively undiscovered South African work still out there. So I'll stop in there, I promise. I don't know if anyone has any questions. I see I'll just quickly read them. Okay, no, those are, okay, well none of those are actual questions, but does anybody have any questions about any of the works or the upcoming auction? Matt, are you there?
I am, Al. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and I've been a long-standing fan of Bruce Arnott for years. and I think his thesis can be found in the Michaelis Library, and it makes for some really amazing reading. I was actually taught English by his sister, who was Dr. Jill Arnott in Pietermaritzburg. So it's
Oh, wow.
yeah, it's a small world. I think, Al, shall we leave it there? Let's give it 2 minutes for questions. We just as you can see, Tessa Reddy, thank you so much, Tessa, and Natasha Dicey, thank you again so much for coming, and it's always a pleasure listening to Al. Thank you so much again, Alastair. Just to let everybody know about the schedule next week. We will be running again Monday through Friday, and Monday we will be joined by Roland Peens and Hugo Jacobs, doing their part 3 of their Bordeaux, introducing the Bordeaux theme, and they are going to be just running through the final lots by the producers. And that's part 3 with introducing Bordeaux with Hugo Jacobs and Roland Peens. Tuesday, we're going to be joined by Vanessa Phillips and Sophie Louise Froelich from our Decorative Arts and Jewellery departments. And I think they're going to be giving us a talk of items out of the curiosity cabinet. And so those are going to be highlights from them. Wednesday, we're going to have Jean Leclue-Theron and Dr. Gerard de Villiers, and they're going to be talking about the Laubscher and Laubscher. That's Maggie and Eric. So that's going to be quite an interesting talk. And then Kirsty's going to be looking a little bit more in scrutiny at some of the Walter Battis works that we've got. So that's Wednesday. Thursday is going to see Wilhelm van Rensburg, and he's going to be talking to us about Christo Coetzee and Robert Hodgins, as well as exploring the tradition of still life that we've got on the sale. So he's going to be looking at some of our still lives. That's Thursday with Wilhelm van Rensburg, speaking of Christo Coetzee, Robert Hodgins, and the still life tradition. And then Friday, I'm going to be speaking about Stern the Traveller, in the selection of travel logs, really, that we've got of Stern spanning over her career, and I suppose documenting at various points moments in her global travel and African travel, indeed, with Zanzibar. And I'll also be looking at Florian Wozniak. We've got 2 quite lovely lots that I think would go unnoticed. I think Friday is a good day to look at his menorah, which is quite fantastic. Then Ian will be looking at bringing light to the Gregoire Bunzaya. We've got quite a substantial amount of Gregoire Bunzaya, some quite important ones, some quite early ones on the sale. So Ian's going to shed some light on those. And then a marvelous Anne Palmer will be looking at Tretchkov and Peter Clarke. So that's our roundup for next week. Please be sure to join us, same time, same place. Today we were joined by Dr. Alastair Meredith, giving us his highlights and hidden gems. Hugely informative. Al, again, you set the benchmark high, so it's always nice to hear you. And thanks so much for joining us. Final words from you.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Matt. Thanks everybody for joining us. Yeah, we'll see you on on Monday.
See you Monday. Cool.
Yeah. Bye bye.
Have a good weekend. Cheers, Al. Bye bye.